Welcome everyone to the next presentation. Now we have Michael Friedrich from GitLab showing us a little bit the details for developers regarding AI. So you might have to take some notes and see the slides later on the website. Yeah, welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation. I built this presentation, I think 3 weeks ago. I agreed on it, so thanks, Rocher, for asking. And I thought about making it a learning experience, and it also is my own learning experience. So this is me. This is a legal disclaimer. This is only research. It's not about GitLab today. It's about technology. And I thought of learning AI can be challenging, and to some extent I was learning AI while writing code and then rewriting code and some things like that. And I didn't really understand what is an LLM, what is RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation, what are agents, magic. Then there were some standards like MCP, additional learning practices and things that I learned for myself that actually work. So I want to show you something that I researched and give you some ideas how to get productive and efficient using AI, and then also some use cases from more like a use case perspective, less a focus on IDEs and tools. That's for you to research. And I also have some wish lists for what I want to see in the future from platforms and IDEs for context and agentic AI. And in the end, I also want to inspire you to think how you would use it and then have a discussion for the next 2 days. So I'm here to learn with you together in public. Yeah, that's about it. When I started looking at LLMs, I was like, oh yeah, it has tokens, it has a temperature, it has a model, it generates something. I have no idea what it does. And I was basically overloaded 2 years ago when I started learning. And so I thought how could I use that? Should I be using an existing model? Should I be using ChatGPT? Could I maybe run an LLM locally? Is this even possible? And which question should I ask? Should I ask about technology? Should I ask what is the weather today? What kind of information would be possible in that regard? Then I found a nice video from IBM, which is helpful to understand it from a technology perspective, but I really wanted to try it out. And so over time, specific models came across, on the SaaS only side, we have proprietary models from OpenAI, from Anthropic, from Google, from different other vendors. But there's also open source models or open models available, like Llama or Mistral or DeepSeek, Gemma, Qwen, and so on. And I also needed to understand that there's model abstraction vendors, which is like Google Vertex AI, AWS Bedrock, and others, which kind of provide models as a service, as a transparent proxy, and so on. But I really wanted to focus on running it locally with Llama, which I found, I think, in late 2023 at KubeCon. They had a nice presentation there, and there was a booth, and I was very much engaged because it was a really nice open source project and still is. It's easy to install, so I installed it on my MacBook and then pulled the model, and then it worked. And so this is the 5-minute success for me as a developer. It was actually technology for me. I don't need to understand what token sizes are until I hit it. But certainly it's relatively easy to install. On a contrary, not every developer might have access to a powerful hardware or desktop. This is an Apple MacBook M1, which works fine. I have a gaming PC, which also works fine, but maybe it doesn't work on every environment. And I also learned that some IT security teams don't like local Llama runs. So it's always a pro and con thing. When I was experimenting with that, I also learned LLMs on their own are huge, so that the trained models and the data require certain hardware and software. And then I learned about quantization, and it was I'm now a data science engineer. I have no idea what it exactly means, but there's a way to kind of condense down a large language model to a smaller model. And I was able to use the 3B models with Llama 3.2 on the MacBook, which I will be using throughout the talk for now. And I can actually ask it to create a Python web application and generate me some code, which can be a helpful way to get started using LLMs. Then I thought maybe I can run LLMs on my Raspberry Pi, which I got finally after the availability was a little more after the pandemic. And it worked somehow. So installing an SSD with a Raspberry Pi 5, you can run LLMs, but the installation will immediately tell you with Llama it runs on your CPU only. So there's no GPU attached to that. There are some videos on YouTube that's explain to you how to run LLMs on a Raspberry Pi, and at the end you see a GPU attached to the PCI Express port, which is not the cheap home lab hardware that I can afford or that I would put in production at home. But I started testing with it, and nowadays, or like in 2025, there's smaller models available, like this tiny Llama, and this can actually run on a Raspberry Pi in a reasonable amount of time. So it could be a good integration, for example, into Home Assistant for running local LLMs and doing some home automation, which is on my personal long to-do list. Then I thought maybe I could use, so I'm building a GitLab runner cluster with Raspberry Pis at the moment. Maybe I could use that cluster to kind of shift or share the workload, the inference calls somehow with an open source project, which is called Distributed Llama, and then use that. Maybe it's expensive. I didn't test it yet, so I didn't have time. But this could be something to kind of keep in mind, that you can share the LLM query call, and someone maybe in the audience knows better than I, kind of to share the workload and then use that in a specific way, also in a home lab to learn, and in production it looks certainly different. Then there was the NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano Super Development Kit announced, and I learned the Super is just a firmware upgrade, but it's still great. The firmware is really, so I appreciate it's really open source and it's available, but it was a rough upgrade cycle I needed to take. But then I was able to use an SSD and use the Jetson containers, like Docker containers running on the Ubuntu, and actually have faster LLMs running on that hardware. So in the end, the same use case that I did on the Pi, which took like roughly a minute or even more, was done in 12 seconds on this specific hardware kit. And so I'm currently experimenting with that to kind of see how well I can integrate it in existing applications, maybe running GitLab on a Raspberry Pi and then connecting it to that or something like that. But I really like the way that it's affordable. I think I invested roughly 300 euros into that, just to make sure that I can really use LLMs in that sense. So like from a comparison standpoint, it looks really great in that way. But yeah, I was curious if I could actually use this event and ask the LLM, in this case, it's Llama 3.2, ask about the open source at Siemens event, and which talks I can specifically attend for community onboarding. So I was curious if an LLM can answer that. And I mean, I know the answer, it cannot, but running that query in an abstracted way, so like using a specific Python library, I think it's from LangChain in that example, and then querying that, led me to the response, or the LLM said, well, I cannot really answer that question, because I don't have real-time access to the specific schedule of the events. But I can recommend you something. So it hallucinated and made something up, but it was still, it tried to think for me, and I appreciate that when someone does a summary for me. But this is just the introduction. We will solve that problem. So the idea here is to fix that context problem over the next minutes. Now, if I want to add more context for the LLM, there's Retrieval Augmented Generation, RAG, when you kind of see that. So in essence, it means when the LLM cannot answer a specific question, you might load data passed into chunks in a vector database as embeddings into that specific context. And that works really great in that way that we can pass anything, even the event schedule, which I scraped from the website, from open source siemens.com, into a markdown file. So I used Claude to generate that for me because I'm lazy. And then kind of have that data available, pass it into chunks, and use a vector database to load it into the LLM memory or into the LLM AI context. And then the response, which I got from the same query again, it was like based on the provided context, the LLM can provide a recommendation for a talk about community onboarding. And I was a little like surprised to see my own talk, which is about AI fundamentals. And I tested it multiple times, and I was like, this doesn't make any sense. But it said it cannot find anything additional. So probably the way that the data is passed as embeddings is not perfect or doesn't really work that way. So like splitting it by 10 lines or chunk size something, this can really scramble your data, and it's not just loading something into AI context and it magically works. So there's technology and perfection or some optimization required. So RAG works somehow. Then, probably can't really see the flowchart, but the slides are public, so you will get access immediately after the talk. So when RAG is not enough, there is sort of tool calling, and the problem with large language models is that they are generators, so they cannot really execute a script command or something on local host or on the hosts. But they can generate a JSON, which kind of wraps those commands and adds some metadata and some instructions for the environment running the LLMs, so that infrastructure actually executes those commands and then feeds the output into the LLM context again. This is like a little brain fuck, but when you try it, you understand it better. So I thought, okay, let's try that. What I did here is I didn't want it to load Markdown again, but instead decided to convert the Markdown into a JSON and then simulate a web server REST API, something like that, and actually use that as a data source for a tool call. So I can write a tool like a Python script or command that queries a REST API. So the preparation was to actually create a web server. Again, this is AI generated. And then as a second step, create a function or a tool function that gets registered, like search event talks, which then queries our web server or the API live, uses the response and puts it into AI context. And based on that, the LLM then said, I recommend 2 talks about community onboarding. One is Breaking Barriers Community Onboarding by Raymond Hook, which is tomorrow, so over there. And You Don't Need to Be Linus Torvalds by Dominik Schmiedle from Giant Swarm, which I think is a lightning talk tomorrow. So this was actually more accurate results on the existing data, just with a refined data format. And certainly, hopefully, the event website gets a REST API after my talk. Or I can contribute to that, sorry. But certainly, it shows a way to actually query live data and put that into LLM context. And everything I show here runs locally on my MacBook. Just didn't want to pull any LLMs during the talk. Then the idea was like these tool callings, you really need to be a developer, and it kind of breaks and it might not work that way. What if I can not only use a tool call or a specific script function, maybe wrap that into an agent and have these agents communicate with each other. So the agents decide, I need to ask an LLM, I need to use a specific tool to fulfill my purpose or to fulfill the ask that is presented in the prompt, and even do some planning, some execution, some memorizing, caching, whatnot. And this is a very complex thing. The great idea behind that is there are frameworks out there, like LangGraph by LangChain, which the GitLab engineering teams also use, but there's also CodeChain by Microsoft and Crew.ai or Crew AI. I didn't understand it, so last year we had a DevOps camp in Nuremberg, and we spontaneously did a live session about learning sightseeing activities using AI agents in Nuremberg, which was a nice experience as well. We can also use it for our use case, querying the event schedule again, using the same web server API, but in this case, rewriting the code in the sense that we still provide the different tool function calls, but then instruct the system prompt in a way that it first searches for all the relevant talks using the search tool, then does an analysis to generate more insights, and create a personalized schedule for the user. So I'm interested in community onboarding, but certainly there could be different interests involved with that. And using that communication between the models and the agents, it came up with a personalized schedule. It would even check for overlaps or conflicts. Fortunately, we have just one track, the single day, but you could use that example for a different schedule as well. The last thing I want to touch on from a technology learning perspective, and I think having a real use case is much more engaging than just copying some source code. There's the model context protocol, which sort of has plug-in availability, and the website describes it as USB-C port for AI applications. You can add more context, be it whether an agent, an LLM, some reg data, something else, in a standardized, abstracted way to add context into the actual LLM calls. It was originally created by Anthropic, and OpenAI adopted it into their official SDK, so probably it's now an industry standard. I would say it's still early stages, so it's really in rapid development, and I think we need to understand where it's heading. Another thing that recently came up is agent-to-agent communication, like A2A, was initiated by Google, is supported by many, and the idea is like to add on top of MCP, which you can use like for context, the live data, and A2A is more the communication layer between agents or for agents on an interoperability perspective. That's how I would see it. It's not, they are not competitive, but you kind of can combine them. If you want to like focus on MCP, and I didn't find any implementation examples for A2A yet, or I didn't have time, we can actually kind of refactor the agentic AI code that we wrote earlier and register specific MCP tools using an abstracted MCP library. So they have an SDK for Python. And then repeat the steps and see the agents coming up with the proposals again. So they again will propose the schedule. You can actually then see that the LLM is thinking and uses specific tool calls. So it's very verbose. As a user, I will probably never would be interested in that way. But the idea here is really that you see at the bottom again the summary of the recommended talks. And the good thing, which isn't really shown on the slides here, is the code is not 300 lines of code, but it's very short, or relatively short in that way, and allows you as a platform engineer or DevOps engineer, for example, to create a service like you're creating with LLMs to play around with, could also be a way to provide a service for MCP or some more deeper product integrations. Because if you let everyone create their own MCP servers, you will probably have maintenance hell, security hell, and everything else you don't want to imagine. And there needs to be a certain standardized way, which I will have on the wish list later on. The source code is, for all these examples, is open source and already available. So it was a nice Saturday, I have an idea hacking session. When I started learning AI, I also want to share some insights that I learned on the way. So I wished I knew them before, but I hope they will be helpful for you to get started more easily. I used to have a habit, I didn't ask questions in my career. I optimized my Google search keywords. And when I needed to ask a chat prompt, I was like, I have no idea. And my friends were using it to generate job application motivation letters, and I was like, what should I ask? And I started to develop it as a habit to only ask a chat prompt and not open my browser tabs 100 of them, and I get more productive by that. I also treat AI as a human being, so I say please and thanks. Sometimes I'm annoyed, so I just say fix it, but I try to be kind, which is helpful for a conversation. And I also oftentimes, or sometimes I just say, fix that, and then it says, well, maybe this, and make something up. So describing the context and adding more, like this is my environment, this is my special thing that I have, will provide you with better answers for that. Yeah, it's like learning together. The thing is, AI thinks it's correct, but sometimes it's not. So challenge AI outputs, especially when you say you want to have an abstract or something with 100 characters, it generates something which 155. So LLMs and AI is not good at counting characters that it generates. It gets better. There's certain ways to kind of do that. But I learned to kind of really challenge that and say, well, you didn't implement that function. This says, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot. Here's the revised version. And I mean, that's great. But if I copy paste everything blindly, I might copy something that causes a production incident, for example. You can also iterate on output. So sometimes it generates a markdown table for me and I actually want to have a JSON. And just think about it, treat the conversation, make it a conversation and refine it. And the last thing I found out was explain it like I'm 5. Works actually pretty well to understand complex technology. And last year someone asked about COBOL and I had no idea what it is or what it does. And so I was learning it using AI. And that prompt, like explain it like I'm 5, was very helpful to really get an understanding of, okay, this is the high level version or the not so much technology version of that. And then go deeper and actually generate code or explain code using AI. If you want to get better outputs, this is also something I learned by myself when doing job interviews at GitLab. There's the STAR model, which says situation, task, action, and results, which I think you can also map on an AI prompt and say, this is the problem with the situation I'm in. I need to fix that specific problem or generate a flow. Yeah, the flow diagram for microcontrollers and sensors. In the first iteration, the task would be to use a temperature sensor and an Arduino Uno board. Okay. And then I would say keep the flow precise. And the expected output could be an ASCII art. And then I can say, well, can you change the format to murmur charts? Because it knows the context already, it can produce me another output. And the below is a murmur chart that I could just copy paste in my docs or let an AI agent actually create that for me. So it's really moving fast, and I found it a good habit, a good pattern. I would encourage you to also try it out and let me know if it works for you. Maybe this can become a helpful standard in the future. There are a few more books and videos and Reddits and also LinkedIn accounts that I'm following to stay up to date. I also watched a video about how transformers actually work, which is very mathematics and data science. But at some point, it finally makes sense how LLMs work. So I would highly recommend watching that video. From a practical use cases perspective, I thought of, I want to show some IDEs and some tools. And then I was like, I don't want to talk about tools today. But I'm currently learning NeoVim. So after 20 years Vim, I'm migrating to NeoVim because there's Lua and more fancy things, I would say. I'm still not there, but I thought maybe I can connect the Llama Chat API with NeoVim. And I found plenty of plugins, but I wanted to have like the raw source code. So I asked AI, can you generate a Lua script for me? So it did. And in 5 minutes, I actually had a Lua script that works asking NeoVim a question, which sends it to a local Llama instance. And the GitLab repository is also here. So if you want to see it, you can actually try it out yourself. And for me, this is kind of the finally a success moment. I can continue working on that and maybe adopt an official plugin that the NeoVim community provides. Other use cases, and there are so many for developers, could be anything that is painful or boring. Use AI for that. So I learned to love summarizing merge request diffs for the description, which generates some magic text for me, and I don't need to think what function and so on happened before. I still need to review that, but I find it really, really refreshing to actually leverage that in GitLab. Also similar to issue discussion summaries, I'm currently learning how automated code reviews work, debugging CI/CD pipelines. So I hate the stack traces, and nowadays I just copy it somewhere. I just say, AI, please explain and fix it. At some point, I want AI agents to fix it for me. Generating documentation, which is something that customers often ask, can we use AI to continuously generate documentation, like from a development architecture perspective, but also anything that comes to mind for onboarding, making contributions easier, help others understand what's actually going on in the software. And last but not least, modernize software like we learned before in the talk. It can be a great way to understand architecture and also the language standards, a different functionality. I researched something, and this is not about GitLab here, but it's really about showing you proof that you can convert or migrate COBOL to Java, Perl to Python, and even C to Rust using AI, which I learned and researched last year. And I think it's a great use case to consider not automating everything, but using AI for your advantage, for learning, for automating tasks. And for a demo last week or 2 weeks ago, I migrated from C++ 11 to C++ 17, like an entire code base. And it's on the way to working. It's not entirely always working, but we're getting there. Another use case is understanding security vulnerabilities, like CWE 134. I have no idea. I see it somewhere, or I get an issue assigned to fix it. Can actually use AI to help me understand what it is, what the impact would be, an example exploit, and then, for example, ask for a specific implementation and hopefully get a fix generated. And this is more like using a local LLM to get an answer for that. Certainly, there's vendors and enterprise software that already builds that in a nice way, but you can also do it on your own. Another way I just mentioned is open source contributions. Learning and understand the code base, style guide documentation, maybe even finding the good first issues that are hidden in 10,000 different other issues. And this is also something we want to get better at GitLab. Generating, refactoring, and fixing code could be an idea. But also, again, debugging and troubleshooting, because I, as a newbie or as a first-time contributor, I have no idea how CI/CD works for that project. So I could use some AI help for that. Raymond will be talking about the GitLab contributors platform tomorrow and maybe touch a little on AI. So I would recommend his talk. Yeah, and the learning experience could also be a thing. So the demos that I showed you before about MCP and RAG, this was 90% Claude 4 Sonnet, 9% GitLab Duo, and 1% myself to some extent. So I was using AI to generate learning content, which could be an idea also for other use cases, onboarding and so on. Last but not least, for the wish list, I would love to have something that is intelligent AI context, like use RAG, agents, MCP, but also that optimize parsing of data into chunks, like understand the source code semantics, like the AST, the trees, building dependencies, fast lookups, code search on steroids, if you will, but also put into context and say what is beyond code. We need issues, we need MRs, we need some discussions, history, anything that is helpful to better understand why a change happens, how a change happens, why it caused a production incident, and so on, all integrated into a platform. One thing to go there is knowledge graphs. And this is a very technically complex thing, but the GitLab teams are working on that, so you can peek into them, peek into the epics that are linked here and see how they are doing it. Essentially, it's an idea to create those hash trees and use graph databases to represent the code search as an AI context and have that fully integrated not only in the IDE, but also the platform where merge requests and other things are happening. It's still on the way, so this is wish list. Another wish list item is agentic AI platforms. So now we have agents, MCP, and everything around. Could we have autonomous agents in the background running on the platform, fixing CI, troubleshooting performance problems with observability and metrics, and just use the chat as a command center to interact with that, and then say, please fix that, run again, and come back, or maybe have some sort of autonomous auto-discovery for APIs, and then come up with something. I don't know exactly how this will work, but I would love to experiment with that. Last but not least, for MCP, servers and agents, I think we still need to treat it as software development or like DevSecOps workflows. So we have code, we need to test it, we need to secure it and then release it. We need a marketplace somehow for trusted vendors, especially in enterprises, where you can't just install an MCP server and enjoy and have fun, and then you have a rootkit in your environment at some point on the next update. From a developer experience point of view, I would love to have more libraries and SDKs for platform teams to provide that to the audience, and also a secure installation, because running a Docker container or NPM something might not work in a compliance requirement. And I also think that if we install MCP servers now and put it in production, there might be a supply chain attack possible at some point when you have a rogue MCP server in your environment. So we need to keep an eye out for that as well. Now, moving from the 101 to the 201, I would love to have you think about the most inefficient task in the DevSecOps workflow or development workflow, and then think about how could agents, MCP, AI help with that. So we can discuss that the next 2 days. Yeah, and with that, it was a lot of information. Everything is public under that URL. The GitLab projects are open source. The QR code is for the slides. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I go as DNS Michi. Thanks, and we have time for questions. It's the first time I'm under my time. And if there are no questions, please come to me. I'm here to help you and learn with you.
Then, thanks a lot, Michi.
Thank you.